Kevin Pelton covers the NBA for ESPN, ESPN.com. One of their NBA insiders recently wrote a piece regarding the Sixers without Ben Simmons. I don't know if he could update that really quickly and do one for losing both of those guys, but we'll see if he has any quick on the feet reactions to them losing both of them, because he wrote about the potential impact of Ben Simmons' back injury and the playoff race just a couple of days ago, Kevin. But I don't know what this team does without both of those guys. But how about losing just Simmons and their ability to move on without him? It seems that they are really struggling, very small sample size, but really having a hard time figuring out what to do without Ben Simmons.
Yeah, I mean, this is a team that I think in some ways probably was more dependent on Simmons than Embiid, even if Embiid is the better player, just because of the fact that, with Embiid, they've got the backup plan of Al Horford sliding over to center, and those, smaller lineups with Simmons playing in space and playing in transition were quite effective. But as far as a backup playmaker, not the same kind of, alternatives to Simmons. I thought Alec Burks would take on a bigger role. That was more or less the role that he played with the Warriors, having the ball in his hands a lot, even though he's not a traditional point guard. So far, it's been a lot of Shake Milton, who has played reasonably well, but it hasn't necessarily translated into a strong offense overall.
Yep, you wrote that the Sixers would likely struggle with Embiid on the bench without having Simmons. What about not having both of them? Now what?
Right. I mean, that's the part of the article that remains relevant now that Embiid is sidelined, is that was the big worry. And, it's funny for all the talk about Simmons and Embiid, how well they fit. One of the reasons you have two star players, even if they don't fit ideally together with each other, is because, well, if one of them goes down, you can just reorient your offense to focus on the other. If you don't have either of them, now you're in pretty deep trouble. The Sixers have been badly outscored this season with both Simmons and Embiid on the bench. It's understandable. They've still got quality players, the rest of the original starting five, you've still quality players, but those aren't guys that are, primary offensive creators. They're secondary creators and have been effective in those roles. But now you're asking them, I think, to do entirely too much offensively. Now, I don't think they're going to keep playing as poorly going forward as we saw last night in Cleveland. It'll help if you don't have the shock of kind of being forced into that mid-game with the injury to Embiid. But it's definitely dire times for the Sixers offensively.
All right, ESPN NBA insider Kevin Pelton with us here. Now, last night Embiid goes out, and what's left over is Tobias Harris on a max deal, Al Horford, a multiple-time All-Star, Josh Richardson, pretty good player out there, and yet you lose on the road against the Cleveland Cavaliers. Is that an answer to maybe those guys are not the right fits? I don't want to say around because, look, it's a clunky fit to begin with. But if you can't win with those guys still leading the way, does it suggest that maybe those guys simply aren't good enough?
It's a concern for sure. And I think that was a concern we had last summer. With Horford, it's his age. We know that he's been a very good player and anchor of very successful teams for a long period of time now. But even though he's played well when he's been in the center role with Simmons, he's not the same player at this stage of his career. And Harris's case, was he really that max guy, or was that a product of last summer's free agency and the fact that, he can fit a lot of different places with his skill set? I think, and then also just everything the Sixers gave up to get him from the Clippers at the trade deadline, that kind of put him into that salary spot, even if it maybe was a little higher than he deserved based on his play. I think Richardson probably has the best chance of stepping forward as the lead creator in the next, at least in this next game that we know that Embiid is going to miss, and any additional time he misses. I don't think that he's necessarily fallen short of our expectations, but he also hasn't been the same player when you've asked him to play point guard when Simmons has been off the court.
Kevin, I know you had worked as a statistical consultant to the Pacers, a couple of years back. Do you have anything to consult as to why the Sixers are so dreadful on the road as opposed to being an elite team at home?
Look, everything we've learned about this issue suggests that, it's not something that is going to continue going forward, that, there are teams that you see over a period of time play much better at home than on the road, but that this eventually evens out unless there's a couple of teams that have unique home court advantages because of altitude. Denver typically plays much better at home than on the road, same to a slightly lesser extent with Utah, but for the rest of the league, they basically converge towards the average home court advantage. So, there may be something unique to this Sixers team mentally that they're able to get up for the challenge of playing at home much more than they are on the road. But it's still not something I would expect to continue.
Now, there's been so much talk about Embiid and Simmons and whether they can coexist. Now they both are out, so I think you're going to see a team that is going to struggle probably without both of them. But where do you kind of sit on the fence in terms of those two guys playing together? In other words, when they both come back, if they both come back and get together, do they have enough talent to play together and regardless of where this team sits in the standings to make the playoffs an interesting run for them?
I think it's going to be more difficult this season because you just now, because of the period of time that they're going to miss, aren't going to have as much opportunity to experiment with different things. Like, what did we get? 2 games of Horford, or maybe a little more than that, of Horford coming off the bench with Simmons in the lineup. Not much of a sample size to kind of figure out what the rotations look like with those groups and how those lineups play together. So that's an unfortunate casualty of Simmons' injury, even if he is back in time for the playoffs. I mean, I think at this point, given that they're almost certainly going to be starting the playoffs on the road, even if I don't think that they're uniquely ill-suited to play on the road. Still, that's hard for any team to not have home court advantage in a series. And then, the fact that you'd be potentially looking at in all likelihood a series with Milwaukee in the second round, unless things really go south here, like that combination makes it hard for me to see a deep playoff run for the Sixers this year.
All right. You wrote about the impact on the playoff positioning without Simmons. Now, both of them are out. Now, they do have one of the easiest remaining schedules in the league. I don't know what that means for them having both these guys out, though. But how has the Simmons and now Embiid injury going to impact this playoff positioning for them?
Yeah, I think we really need to see with Embiid. I mean, I think if he is able to get back within the next couple of games here, that they probably have enough, given that schedule, to hold on to the 5th seed. It's really favorable. I think you'd like to have an easy part of your schedule coming up at the end of the season because, that's when teams start going into lottery positioning mode and resting some of their players, even if they don't have serious injuries. We saw the Sixers benefit from that a few years ago when they had the converse of this, where Embiid was out at the end of the season and they still went on that long winning streak with Simmons and a bunch of shooters leading the way. But if it's neither of those two guys, at Cleveland, you can get a little bit easier than that given home court advantage, but it's still one of the easier games you're going to face. So not an encouraging sign for their chances of holding on to 5th if they have neither of those guys for an extended period.
Now, I don't know that you have an answer for this one either because it seems that guys shoot the ball well when they're other places. They come here, and those percentages take a dip. Any hypothesis as to why that is? Tobias Harris shoots 40% with the Clippers. He's out here, not nearly as good. Even down to a guy like Glenn Robinson. He was shooting 40% with the Warriors. He hasn't made 1 3 since he's come over to Philadelphia. So is there any reasoning why that might be?
Sometimes guys get different shot attempts, and that can affect things. But Simmons is a guy who's good at delivering the ball to teammates for three-pointers, so it'd be surprising, I think, if that was the culprit. I can't remember with Harris off the top of my head how that compared to his career average. I think that's the one thing I'd want to look at. But Glenn Robinson, we do know, even though he had a down season in 2018-19, that is around his career average from 3. So I'd expect to see him get it going before too long here.
Yeah, he complained today about his role with the team, and it's like, well, look, dude, you haven't made 1 3-point shot yet. It's hard. He's 0 for 9 since coming over from Golden State, so he has not found his shot here in Philly. Burks has played a little bit better, so we'll see. They play the Knicks tonight. They lost to the Cavs last night without Embiid. They look terrible. You see Tobias Harris and what he did. There was an interesting discussion today between Amin Elhassan and David Fizdale about, hey, that's on the coach. He's got to tell Tobias Harris, you got to get more aggressive. And Fizdale immediately jumped in and said, you're assuming the coach didn't tell him to do so. And we fight a lot about it, the Players League, how much the coach has in hand here. But when you see something like that go on last night, do you look at Brett Brown and say, hey, you lost your best player, you needed to step in and do something? Or do you look at the players last night and say, man, it was one of these guys needed to step up and play better?
I think it's a little from column A, a little from column B. Like, obviously one of the criticisms we've heard about Brett Brown is that he wanted Ben Simmons to start shooting three-pointers, and we still haven't seen it with Simmons. And I think you could take any coach in the league, and Ben Simmons is going to do what he does. But, someone like Harris, even if that isn't necessarily his nature, maybe that's a situation where if you're calling more plays and, designing ways to get him, get the ball in his hands in position to score, then, you can sort of create that even if he's reluctant. So, I think there are some things you can do, but also sometimes it is just about who that player is.
All right, before we roll out of here, I want to get a couple quick NBA thoughts because the Sixers got all sorts of problems, injury-related. What's going on with the Heat?
Yeah, it's a little tough to understand here. They played reasonably well in the first couple games after they got Andre Iguodala, a nice win, and Jay Crowder, who has played an important role for them. Big win over the Jazz before the All-Star break, and then have really slumped since then. I think to some extent the injuries that they've had have also affected them. Not as substantial, but they've been without Tyler Hero and Myers Leonard, and that's changed up their rotation a little bit, along with the additions of Crowder and Iguodala and Solomon Hill. To some extent, it may just be coming back to earth. I mean, this Miami team wasn't necessarily, we weren't necessarily expecting them to be up in this second tier of the Eastern Conference at the start of the season. So, I think that there maybe is probably an element of water finding its level there.
Yeah, and then you look at top of the conference here: Milwaukee, Toronto, Boston. Milwaukee right now 8 games up. So Toronto and Boston, who is the next best? Who is the best? Offers the best challenge to Milwaukee? Is it those two, or do you include someone else?
I mean, Philly is still an intriguing wild card if they get healthy because of their size and what we saw from them last year in the playoffs. But, yeah, I think, Toronto has done a tremendous job of managing, players being in and out of the lineup. Obviously, the losses last summer of Kawhi Leonard and Danny Green. And, they weren't able to beat the Bucks in a showdown the other night, but still acquitted themselves quite nicely when you consider that Marc Gasol and Norman Powell were both out of the lineup in addition to Patrick McCaw off their bench. So, I think Toronto at this point is probably the toughest competitor for Milwaukee in the East. But if Jason Tatum keeps making 50% of his threes, that's subject to change.
Yes. Are you going with New Orleans or the Field for that 8th spot in the West?
I would take New Orleans as long as they stay healthy. I think they also have an extremely favorable schedule down the stretch, have been playing much better since Zion came back. Even before that, they've made up a lot of ground in a hurry, and the other teams, Memphis and Portland in particular, battling injuries, and I think that's going to make it difficult for them to hold off the Pels.
All right, down to number 7, Dallas, 36-23. How many Western Conference teams do you think have a legit shot?
That's an interesting question. I think, obviously the 2 LA teams, I think at this point Houston is enough of a wild card with the smaller lineup and how well they've played since they made the trade for Robert Covington that you have to put them in that group. Denver, I think, is the borderline case to me. We still haven't seen them do it against a quality team like this in the playoffs. They lost with home court advantage last year to the Blazers. I think they're a better team this year, but I think they're right on the edge of that question. And Utah at this point, struggling the way they are, I think probably not a legitimate contender.
Yeah, but Utah's gone from 4 to 6. Oklahoma City's won 4 in a row and moved up to 5 in that time frame. It would be Houston, OKC in the first round. How fun would that be? And then Clippers, Jazz in round number 1 out there. He's Kevin Pelton, at K Pelton on Twitter, and, of course, kind enough to join us, as always, on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Thank you, pal.
All right, thanks as usual for having me.
Yeah, man. Kevin Pelton, like all guests, appear to be the Boardwalk Honda Hotline.